Hello, I've already given you a video which basically explains how to do a paper, and I want to sort of repeat some of the things that I've said in that, but look at it from the standpoint of the Saints Forum essay that you have to do. Well, you have to do 4 of them throughout the whole course, 2 before midterms and 2 after. And from Armstrong's book, I've given you the 4 principal people that you are to do the essay on. The essay is 1,500 words. Now, what I will just do briefly is to give you an idea on how to approach this. The first thing is to read the question. And the question that I ask is, critically assess the theological, philosophical, ecclesiastical and behavioral aspects of the individual's life and thought. Now that in a way is the key to the whole thing, because all you have to do is to follow the order of that. In other words, there's numerous ways of writing essays. But in this way, I'll give you one straightforward way, is to take the individual concern and then look at their theology, their philosophy. Frequently their philosophy and their theology will be together, but you'd need to look for a basic definition of what philosophy would mean. Look at their ecclesiology, in other words, their involvement within church, the tradition that they're in, how that's impacted them, and then of course their behavior in respect of how they've lived out these theological, philosophical and ecclesiastical concepts in respect to what? Their life and thought. So in other words, then you'll have to be involved in doing some sort of biography of the particular author, and then you can connect it to the elements that are mentioned. And in a straightforward way, you could do that just by having sections that would deal with the theological, philosophical, ecclesiastical and behavioral elements. Or in other words, there's 4 elements already in which you could preface it by doing a biography, a short biography, and do an introduction. So when you've done all those things and put them together, then you see what you really want to say. What's the main thesis or idea that you're saying about this particular person? You put that up front in your introduction, so there is a thesis from which that you will argue all these different points. Notice that I've used the word critically assess. The word critical comes from a Greek word, krites, that means judge. And usually in our day it's meant negatively, but I don't mean it negatively. I mean it positively and negatively. In other words, what do you agree with, what do you disagree with? That's basically another way of looking at it in terms of this particular person that you're examining. You look at it, and you're to do it from the standpoint initially of Armstrong's chapter in the book. Armstrong is a Protestant, so he's going to give usually a good interpretation, particularly of Protestant people. And at the same time, what I want you to do is to use other sources. And in the syllabus I've mentioned 1 or 2 other sources. The sources have to be scholarly sources. You've got to use at least 3 besides Armstrong. And I'm relying upon your ability to use Google in a way that you can identify where those sources are from. And rather than it just be anecdotal sources, but these are actually scholarly sources that you use in conjunction with Armstrong. I do that so that you can get different opinions in respect to these authors, and you don't just get one perspective from one author. That way it will be a good research paper. That's a value of what? 1,500 words at least, in the sense of an introduction. Your introduction won't be more than a page, if that, 3/4 of a page. And then you have the body of the paper, which you'll make your arguments, and then you have your conclusion. That's it in its straightforward form, and I've given you one method of actually doing that, which is to follow the question and break down the different categories and identify then what you would say within those categories of what you would look at. Or you could do it in a different way. Another way would be to do a whole biography on the individual, and as you're describing the person's life as you go through it, you bring out critical areas of their theological understanding and their philosophical understanding, and you do it in a way that you assess them too in respect to problems that might occur as you do it. So it's not simply a question of what did they think and what did they believe. I want you to actually put yourself into it from the standpoint of saying then, well, here's a problem in respect to it. Now, I'll give you an example. The example I'm using is that of John Newton that's in Armstrong's chapter. And you're not asked to write about John Newton, but I'll just give you a basic approach to that. The first thing that you would do is to look and you'd see the details of his life. He was born in 1725, and his mother was very influential in bringing him up in the Christian church, but he left that. He became a sailor for a number of years, and he spent the 7 years roaming the African coast as a sailor, looking to get slaves to take them across to the Americas. And it was on one of these trips that he eventually became converted to Jesus Christ in 1748. And from then on his life changed, and he retired from being a sailor and wanted to become a minister, but he had no education. He wanted to be in the Church of England, and he had to have a university education for that. So he learned Greek and Hebrew by himself. He had contact with lots of other preachers, different kinds of preachers like George Whitefield and John Wesley. And finally he got a position in the Church of England, and was very successful in his ministry, primarily as a song writer of hymns, over being a preacher, I think. Of course, he wrote over 260 hymns, and especially the hymn Amazing Grace, and was very influential in not just being influenced by people like John Wesley and George Whitefield, but also he influenced William Wilberforce, who was influential in abolishing slavery in the mid-19th century. So there's a lot of material there that you can look at it from a theological standpoint with John Newton. You get the biography, which is basic, and then from the biography you look and you see certain things that you can bring out and look at. For example, one would be the song Amazing Grace, which is absolutely, what would you call it? It's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. It's been sung by Elvis and Willie Nelson and Joni Mitchell. It's been made into a Broadway play that I think is still going now. There's that marvelous film that's by William Wilberforce that features John Newton with Albert Finney in the lead of it. Amazing Grace was sung when the Berlin Wall fell in the late 80s, when Nelson Mandela was released from prison in South Africa with the birth of the apartheid movement. It was sung with Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. And then, of course, it was played and sung frequently after the terrible events of September the 11th, 2001 in the United States. In other words, then, this is a very powerful song. Part of understanding Newton's theology would be to look at the words in the song, just briefly, and see how these words connote a theology and how that related to actually Newton's behavior. For example, in studying, you find out that he was a Calvinist. So you look up and say, well, what does it mean to be a Calvinist? Well, we actually will cover that in the course of what we're doing in terms of Calvinism and Arminianism. He had friendship with George Whitefield, who was a Calvinist, but he also had friendship with John Wesley, who wasn't a Calvinist. I'm not going to go into what Calvinists thought, but you would do that briefly to work out how that related to his theology. For example, one of the problems that is in John Newton's life is that after he became a Christian in 1748, it was actually another 34 years before he wrote his pamphlet against the African slave trade. So this relates then to the question of what is conversion. And was he advocating slavery all those years from his conversion to when he wrote against the slave trade that influenced William Wilberforce? And then does conversion mean what? Well, you can look at the details of how he was converted and what that meant, and look at conversion itself from the standpoint of what is it that is necessary for one to be converted, and then how does one deal with the events in a person's life that are not commensurate with the biblical teaching. Why did it take 34 years for Newton to actually come to the point of writing this pamphlet that he sent out to all the members of Parliament in England, and which became instrumental in helping William Wilberforce to do what he did, which led to the abolition of slavery. The element of, I'll just pick out one word from Amazing Grace, wretch, that saved a wretch like me. At the end of his life, Newton saw himself in the same position as being a sinner because of what he'd done, but he was, quote, saved by grace. So these are elements that you can look at in terms of his behavior and his theology, in terms of his doctrine of sin. How then does he square his life and conversion in respect to the fact that it took him 34 years to actually then advocate the end of slavery, in respect to his teaching in and acceptance of Calvinism and so forth. He had the ability to mix on so many different levels because of his life experiences and the impact of his personality, where he was influential to people like William Wilberforce and the aristocracy in London. He had a church initially that was about 60 miles north of London, but at the same time he drew from his past of blasphemy when he was a sailor, where he lived such a life of debauchery that he could relate to anybody. He was able to relate on so many different levels then in his ministry, which is why he was so effective. Now, I've just given you just a really sketched notion of this person, John Newton. The idea is, because you're not going to be looking at that, or you'll read the chapter because it's a fascinating chapter, but the idea is that you'll be looking at elements initially of the biography that's in Armstrong, and then you'll be looking at theological elements that will grow from the understanding you get from McGrath's book on basic theology, and you're exploring them and bring yourself into it in the sense of making an argument of saying what you agree with, what you disagree with, what you think was problematic about a particular person's conversion story, or about their theology, or what did it lead to, and what is the situation in terms of the impact of it, and so forth. There's so many things that I could explore in terms of John Newton, which I won't. I stop there because I've used it as an example. But the idea for you then is, in doing this paper, and there's only 4 of them, 1,500 words each, and I've put, as I said, 2 before midterms and 2 after, so you've got time to do these papers and put some really good thought into it so that you can crack open and get the inside of the individual that you are studying and bring yourself into it in terms of a critical assessment of what you think was acceptable and unacceptable or problematic in respect to the individual's spiritual journey. Okay, thanks.